For perspectivists, these geometric bodies became a kind of five-finger exercise. If you could do the perspective of the geometric solids accurately, then you could tackle almost anything, including a more organic form. On the left is Jean Cousin, the French perspectivist in 1560, and on the right Page-Barbour, a much more overtly mathematical demonstration, and his Prospectiva Practica in 1568. So they became a kind of symbol of this elaborate spatial geometry of which the Renaissance artists were master. But they entered astronomy. They entered astronomy via Hirschvogel and also most notably via Kepler, and the great folding plate, the one on the right, it just gives you an indication of how it folds out from the book. The great folding plate from his Mysterio Cosmographicum from 1596 to 97. This was to be built on a large scale, motorized, and even at one point there was a suggestion that the hollow arms of this would be filled with beverages relevant to the planets involved. What he's created here is something which is, as you can see, a series of nested polyhedra, the five regular solids, and this represents uncannily well the ratio of the orbits of the planets, or the ratio of the spheres of the planets, perhaps we should say rather than orbits. He, of course, later formulated the elliptical notion of planetary motion based upon notions of magnetism, but he never abandoned the idea that the underlying explanation for the ratio of the planets was this kind of constructive geometry. Just to give you some idea of what this might have looked like had this ever been built for his patron. This is the great Antonio Santucci celestial globe in the now called the Museo Galileo in Florence, and its wonderful refurbishment. A Ptolemaic system that gives a good idea. This is expensive science. Astronomy was always an expensive science. It was always big science, and needed big patrons with big money. Kepler, Rudolf II, Tycho Brahe, the Danish king, and the Medici, obviously, bankrolling Santucci's great sphere. This has all now been restored. There's a terrific, if you go into the Museo Galileo website, you can see this animated. It is just spectacular. I don't have an animation, thank goodness, because I'm not running at the moment. Kepler, of course, also takes us down to the smaller scale as well. He wrote his treatise on the six-cornered snowflake in 1611, dedicated to Rudolf II, who he called an aficionado or an enthusiast for nothing. There's lots of elaborate humanist punnings going on here between the German nix, the Latin nix for snow, but also to understand nothing, of course, was a sophisticated thing, because the issue of nothing as a philosophical concept is quite something. It's very typical of Kepler's layered humanist approach. And the snowflake being a recurrent symbol across small scale, Robert Hooke's micrographia on the left, with the crystals at the top. Snowflake Bentley, the man in the early 20th century who spent so much time trying to capture the snowflakes in photography with brilliant success, and it's an amazingly difficult thing to do, of course, without high-tech equipment, and these very beautiful modern photographs by Ken Brecht, which adopt an overtly aesthetic mode. So Kepler immediately takes us across these scales from what was then the smallest perceivable to the largest scale that human thought was then grappling with. Robert Hooke's micrographia, again, the famous eye of the fly, which, as we shall see, becomes recurrent. And just to another example, the Ernst Haeckel, the radial area, the foraminifera, these little geometric skeletons. His books became such a popular quarry for artists that he produced them in specific plates, in folios and series for artists called Art Forms in Nature, Kunstformen in Natur. So we've got this continuous sort of echoing of these forms. And what I'm arguing is that they're both inherent in a certain kind of minimal nature organization, because they represent an economy of design, and also that we're immensely attuned to them, whether by nature or nurture, but probably by both. In terms of the smallest scales, in the period when I was in St Andrews, the herpes simplex virus had been the structure, the capsid had been worked out by Horn, Wildey and Russell. Willie Russell was the professor in St Andrews, so I talked to him about this. Those are the negative staining images which they used. As you can see, they're difficult to decipher, but the job was, having picked up that there were pentagonal and hexagonal faces, to come up with a model which actually satisfied that, initially in cardboard and then eventually in wood. And this is an activity which, in a sense, is a kind of artistic activity, this constructional modelling, which still goes on greatly. And interestingly, in labs you often see people who are using elaborate computer programs are still doing bits of paper, bits of cardboard, and doing it by hand, because the relationship between thinking, the hands, the physicality of it, and the visualization is still incredibly important, and computers often don't deliver that kind of directness. I'm not speaking some kind of Luddite, it's just an observation as to how these things are still actually done. And the iconic image of these polyhedra in modern science is carbon-60, discovered by Harry Kroto and the team at Rice University, for which they earned a Nobel Prize. This is from Nature. It's a rather fancy galactic version of carbon-60 with its electron clouds orbiting around it. Again, very functional, but these things rapidly get converted into images which have a lot of visual enjoyment built into them. They become aestheticized. The story of the invention of carbon-60 is very germane to the second theme of the lecture, the domes, as we shall see. That's Harry Kroto and the team at Rice University who discovered this form of carbon. And the job that they did once they had discovered, and once they'd ascertained there was a 60 carbon version which was stable, was how could you array this in a particular way. Harry Kroto had an inclination as a young man to become a designer, and he's now doing a lot of design work. And he clearly has a great graphic imagination and a great visual imagination. He's clearly very good, like Kepler was, like Leonardo was, at this 3D modelling. He also had been to Expo 67 in Montreal and seen the Buckminster Fuller American Pavilion, which was the biggest of all the geodesic domes. And thinking back and thinking how can we get a structure which embodies these 60 carbons in a stable array, he started thinking back to the Buckminster Fuller dome and the way that it used pentagons and hexagons. It also had resonances for him with what footballs or soccer balls looked like at that time. They no longer look like that. They now have curvilinear patches or units sewn onto them. As we know, the name of the carbon-60 became Buckminster Fullerene, known in short as buckyballs.